And welcome to Ethically Speaking, a UCF interdisciplinary series on contemporary moral issues. My name is Steve Kubler, and I'm the organizer of this series, and I'm professor of chemistry and optics and founding associate director of the Center for Ethics at the University of Central Florida. In today's event, Dr. Maeve McKeown joins us to discuss the politics of structural injustice and how it connects to the idea that power brings responsibility. Our speaker today is hosted by Dr. Alex Nicolaitis, who is a postdoctoral scholar with the UCF Center for Ethics. At the end of the presentation, Dr. McKeown will take questions moderated by Dr. Nicolaitis, and please submit your questions directly to him during the talk via chat.
Thank you, Dr. Kubler. I'm honored to be introducing our speaker today, whose stellar work in political theory has been extremely influential in my own work and development as an academic, I should add. I'm especially excited to have Dr. Maeve McKeown here with us today because her area of research, which is structural injustice, has received increasing attention, not just in academic circles, but in political circles as well. Controversy ensues regarding the existence and nature of structural injustice and whether this is even a topic that ought to be taught to students or not. For this reason, I thought that Dr. McKeown, who last year published a book that advances a comprehensive account of structural injustice and the responsibility we hold for it, might shed some light on the topic for us and help us think through these issues. Dr. McKeown graduated with a PhD in political theory from University College London in 2015, where she completed an exceptional dissertation titled Responsibility Without Guilt, in which she amended Iris Marion Young's influential theory on structural injustice. Following her graduation, Dr. McKeown held positions in leading universities. Most notably, she has held fellowships at Goethe University Frankfurt and the University of Oxford, and more recently, she was a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Cambridge. Since 2021, she is located at the interdisciplinary campus Friesland of the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, where she holds the position of assistant professor in political theory. Dr. McKeown's work centers on questions of political and moral responsibility for global structural injustice. In addition to her previously mentioned book titled With Power Comes Responsibility, The Politics of Structural Injustice, published by Bloomsbury Academic, Dr. McKeown has co-edited an exceptional collection of essays on structural injustice published by Oxford University Press. The collection features essays of leading scholars in the field and is also available open access, so you can read it for free. Dr. McKeown has also published articles in leading academic journals, including the Journal of Social Philosophy, Contemporary Political Theory, and Philosophy Compass. Importantly, Dr. McKeown's work is also influenced by her experience as an activist, rendering her not simply a scholar who thinks about questions of political and moral responsibility, but a scholar who bridges theory and action. Dr. McKeown thus sets an example from which anyone interested in thinking about ethics and leading an ethical life has much to learn. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming virtually Dr. Maeve McKeown.
Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's very interesting to be giving a talk on structural injustice in Florida in current times, Trump state. So yeah, let's see how this goes. I will share my slides with you now. Okay, is that working? Yeah, great. Okay. So today I'm going to talk to you about my book, With Power Comes Responsibility, The Politics of Structural Injustice. And before getting into it, I like to explain a little bit about why I decided to write this book. So I've got some images here. This is the kind of politics that was going on in the late 90s, early 2000s when I was a teenager. So I was really obsessed with Naomi Klein's book, No Logo. And the Battle of Seattle that happened in '99 in Seattle. And I was also an activist in the anti-sweatshop movement, protesting at corporations like The Gap. So these were the kinds of questions I was interested in whenever I started my politics and international relations degree at the University of Manchester. And I was really surprised to find that this was just not on the agenda. Right? So in a kind of standard politics degree, this kind of anti-capitalist politics was not really what was being talked about in academia, at least where I was studying. And this was until I discovered Iris Marion Young. Young wrote a hugely influential paper before she wrote her book on structural injustice, which talked about responsibility for the global garment labour situation. And I just thought, wow, this woman just gets it. She absolutely understands what's going on here. I completely agree with her. I'm so into this theory, and it made me want to be a political theorist. So it was a bit of a non-linear trajectory after that, but eventually I did a PhD on Young's theory of structural injustice and responsibility for it. And then eventually that PhD became the book. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about the three main themes in the book. The first is defining structural injustice. So what is structural injustice? The second is attributing responsibility for it. So who's responsible for a structural injustice like sweatshop labour? And the third is structural change. Okay, so first defining structural injustice. So normally when we think about injustice, we might think about cases like this. So we've got Putin's invasion of Ukraine, we've got the genocide or the war in Gaza, we've got police brutality against African Americans, and we've got the EU migrant crisis. Now, what these cases share in common is that there's one individual or organisation that we can point to and say it is their fault. Right? So with Russian invasion of Ukraine, we can point to Putin and say he is responsible. With the genocide in Gaza, we could point to Netanyahu or the state of Israel and say it's their responsibility. With the police force in America, we could say it's the police force. And with the EU migration crisis, we can point to the EU. But when we look at cases like this, the situation is different. So when we think about climate change or homelessness or sweatshops, there isn't one particular agent that we can point to and say that it is their fault, right? So this is when Iris Marion Young came in and she came up with this idea of structural injustice. So according to Young, structural injustice is different to state repression. Instead, it's the outcome of millions of peoples and groups' normal, everyday activities. So it's us going about our normal, everyday lives that is resulting in the injustices of climate change, homelessness, and sweatshops. It's difficult to avoid participation in these injustices. So we're all contributing to climate change all the time just by heating our homes or maybe cooling our homes in Florida. It's a bit of a different situation to the Netherlands. We're all participating in housing markets, we can't avoid that, and we all need to participate in clothing culture, at least to some extent. We all have to wear clothes. And the unintended consequence of everybody's participation in these normal structural processes are the domination and oppression of certain social groups. So these are the three features of Young's way of thinking about structural injustice, and this is her definition of it. So Young defines structural injustice as follows. Structural injustice is a kind of moral wrong distinct from the wrongful action of an individual agent or the repressive policies of a state. Structural injustice occurs as a consequence of many individuals and institutions acting to pursue their particular goals and interests, for the most part within the limits of accepted rules and norms. Now, structural injustice theory and the way that Young's defined structural injustice has been super influential in contemporary political theory and political philosophy, as Alex was saying in the introduction. And really where Young was coming from with this idea of structural injustice was to intervene in the global justice debate. So the global justice debate was really big in political philosophy in the 90s and the 2000s. And there were two main positions in that literature. There was cosmopolitanism, which argued that we have duties of distributive justice that are global in scope, and there was statism that argued that duties of distributive justice are limited to the nation state. But what Young highlighted was the importance of political, economic, and social structures in generating and maintaining injustice, right? So in the global justice debate, they weren't really talking about economics, they weren't talking about social norms and social structures. And Young was saying, wait a minute, there's this whole other element of global injustice that you're not really capturing by thinking of things in terms of the state or the global scope. And she also changed our way of thinking about global justice because she defined injustice as domination or oppression of social groups instead of just thinking about the distribution of resources. And the other thing that Young did was really highlight the difficulty of attributing responsibility for structural injustice. So who's responsible for these injustices, and how do we even start to think about responsibility for them? And Young's definition of structural injustice has become the standard definition of the literature, and she in fact created the structural injustice literature. So this book here, Responsibility for Justice, is really her main statement on structural injustice theory and responsibility for it. The book was published in 2011 and it was published posthumously, so she died in 2006, and the book actually wasn't finished. But amazingly, it's gone on to sort of create this entire literature in political philosophy. Now, I'm a huge fan of Young, as I've said. I really admire her work. I think her intervention was essential. But I think there's a big problem with her theory of structural injustice, and this is what I make the focus of my book. So Young's definition of structural injustice, I would argue, is pure structural injustice. So in cases of Young's structural injustice, people can't avoid participating in it. There are no identifiable agents who can change it, and it requires systemic change to overcome the injustice. Now, I would argue that when we think about power, excuse my Northern Irish accent, it's actually really hard to find a case of pure structural injustice, right? So once we incorporate an analysis of power, it's going to change how we think about structural injustice. And I do this by looking at Young's paradigm cases of structural injustice. So when we think about homelessness, Young argues that there's no identifiable agent who's responsible for homelessness. But actually, rich states could end homelessness if they wanted to, right? And there are examples of this happening in practice. So an example is Finland's Housing First policy, where they've pretty much eradicated homelessness. There's also Vienna's state-subsidized housing program, which has greatly reduced homelessness within that city. So I argue that in some cases there are powerful agents with the capacity to alleviate structural injustice, and they're failing to do it. And this is what I call avoidable structural injustice. So we have cases of structural injustice where we have powerful agents, usually the state. It could also be powerful corporations who have the capacity to alleviate the injustice, and they simply don't do it. So this injustice could be avoided if the powerful agents took action. And sweatshop labour is a different case again, because in the case of sweatshop labour, I would argue that multinational corporations are deliberately perpetuating structural injustice because they are benefiting from it. So it's not just that multinational garment corporations could alleviate structural injustice, it's that they are deliberately perpetuating it. They're acting in various ways to keep this injustice going because they're deriving all sorts of benefits from it. So this is what I call deliberate structural injustice. So in cases of deliberate structural injustice, we have powerful agents who are deliberately maintaining the injustice. And I'll just give you some examples of how garment corporations are acting within the garment industry to perpetuate this structural injustice. So the first and most obvious way in which they do this is through lobbying. So large corporations are lobbying their home states, they're lobbying international institutions, they contribute to campaign financing and PR campaigns in order to try to get what they want. And the bigger the corporation, the bigger their capacity to do this. And at the international level, corporations work together in business roundtables and associations to lobby international organizations to try to get what they want. A second way in which multinational corporations exercise power in this industry, or more generally, is through rule setting in the industry. So they do this through public-private and private-private partnerships, PPPs. So the image I have here is of the Ethical Trading Initiative. The Ethical Trading Initiative is a private-private partnership. So this is where corporations have got together and decided on some rules for their industry together. And of course, these are pretty weak. They're not legally binding. So they're giving the impression of doing something ethical when actually it's a toothless initiative. And Doris Fuchs describes it like this. These arrangements, these PPPs, provide opportunities to business actors to set rules directly. They, the businesses, determine issues, define problems, and design, adopt, implement, and enforce solutions themselves. Moreover, to a substantial extent, this activity takes place without public influence or control. So the corporations are setting the rules of the game for their industries. Another way in which corporations are exercising power is through corporate social responsibility. Now, corporate social responsibility is not necessarily a bad thing. It does many good things. It can fill in the gaps of state and global governance. Sometimes corporations have more capacity to act on social justice and environmental issues than some states do, but it's not always used for good, right? So businesses decide which NGOs they're going to engage with, and this is obviously an asymmetrical relationship where the business has control. There's no public oversight of corporate social responsibility. It can, in fact, undermine more stringent rule setting by government because the corporations are saying, look, we're already doing these good socially responsible things. And so it gives the impression that we don't need regulation in these areas. And it also builds multinationals' moral authority. So it looks like they are doing the right thing and we believe in them as moral and responsible actors. And the final way in which corporations are exercising power is through manipulation. So I've got an image here of a very famous advert from Nike, Just Do It. So corporations are constantly manipulating us as consumers into buying their products and buying more of their products. They do that through traditional advertising like this, in print media, on billboards, on the TV, but increasingly online, of course, using influencers and social media, paying for product placement in film and TV, finding all sorts of new techniques in order to try and manipulate us into continuing to buy new clothes. Now, you might at this point think, well, aren't multinational corporations constrained, right? So are they really deliberately perpetuating structural injustice? Aren't they acting within constraints? They're acting within competitive markets. They have to compete with each other. They have to keep costs as low as possible in order to remain competitive in the industry. Well, I don't deny any of that. Multinationals certainly are constrained within the global garment industry. However, they're not as constrained as they would like us to believe. And an example here would be the Bangladesh Fire and Building Safety Accord. So this picture is of the Rana Plaza factory collapse in 2013 that you might remember. So this was a factory that collapsed and over 1,100 workers were killed. There was a huge media spotlight on the Bangladesh garment industry at this point in time, a lot of pressure on the corporations who were sourcing their product from Bangladesh. And in response to that, the Bangladesh Fire and Building Safety Accord was created. Now, the accord was a legally binding agreement. It lasted for 5 years, 2013 to 18. It was extended for a further 3 years to 2021, and then it expired. Under the accord, thousands of factories in Bangladesh were inspected for fire and building safety issues. Over 90% of those factories remediated those issues. 2 million workers in Bangladesh were trained in fire and building safety. And because it was a legally binding agreement, 2 cases were brought to The Hague and the unions won, and the corporations were forced to pay out to their workers, right? So the accord shows that it is possible to improve conditions in this industry, and actually at very minimal cost to the corporations themselves. So the question is, why did this only occur in Bangladesh and for a very limited period of time? Why isn't it occurring in other garment exporting countries? Why aren't we seeing fire and building safety being addressed across the board? It's well within the grasp of these massive multinational corporations to do that. And to give even more weight to this point, this is from the Business of Fashion and McKinsey's State of Fashion report from 2019. So this is from the belly of the beast, right? This is not like a lefty kind of outlet. This is from McKinsey, and it shows the super winners in the global garment industry. This is from 2017, but these were the top 20 corporations in this industry, and they found that these top 20 corporations, the super winners, made 97% of profits in the global garment industry. So we're told that this is an extremely competitive industry with lots of players, but the reality is that there's 20 corporations who are absolutely dominating this industry. And in fact, in the State of Fashion Report 2024, they found that the super winners are getting 99% of the profits in the global garment industry. So it's gone up. And these super winners have remained relatively stable over time since about the year 2000. Okay, so I wanted to make that point to show you that when we think about power, there's actually a lot more going on when it comes to structural injustice that Young had us believe, right? So Young's definition, I think, is pure structural injustice, where it's difficult to avoid participation, there are no agents to change it, and it requires systemic change. Avoidable structural injustice is where we have powerful agents who could alleviate it and fail to do so. And deliberate structural injustice is deliberately perpetuated by powerful agents who benefit from it. In my book, I spent the first half of the book working on this definition of structural injustice, and I apply it to 3 case studies. So I've been talking mostly here about sweatshop labour, which I think is a deliberate structural injustice. I discuss global poverty as an avoidable structural injustice. So when it comes to poverty, extreme poverty, we have many options on the table for alleviating it, and powerful agents are simply failing to do that. And I describe climate change as a pure structural injustice. Now that is a little bit controversial. That's something people have questioned me about, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Okay, so moving on to attributing responsibility. So whenever I present about structural injustice, and when I was thinking about this topic myself, my real question was, am I responsible for it? Right? So when I was this teenage activist getting involved in the anti-sweatshop movement, I really felt like I was responsible, I was guilty for what was going on in sweatshops. But Young challenged this idea that we are guilty for structural injustice, right? So to do this, she looked at a traditional theory of moral responsibility. So in the picture here, I've got Jerry kicking Tom, right? And this is how we would normally think about moral responsibility. So in this case, there is intention to cause harm. So Jerry kicks Tom, he wants to hurt Tom. There's direct causation of harm. So Jerry uses his leg to kick Tom, he directly causes the harm. And he knows the consequences of his actions. He knows he's going to hurt Tom, right? And this, in traditional conceptions of moral responsibility, is when we would attribute blame to a person. So a person's blameworthy when they intend to cause harm, they directly cause harm, and they know what the consequences of their actions will be. And Young calls this the liability model of responsibility. And she argues that the liability model is a traditional way we think about moral responsibility and some kinds of legal responsibility as well. And Young argues that the liability model doesn't apply when we think about structural injustice, right? So we cannot be held responsible on the liability model. So if we continue with a clothing example, say you or I buy a t-shirt in H&M or Zara or a shop like that, we don't intend to cause harm, right? We simply want to buy a t-shirt. We're not trying to harm anybody. We're not directly causing harm. So you or I, we're not exploiting the workers, right? It's not us who does it. It's somebody else way down the supply chain. In terms of knowledge of the consequences, do we know what the outcomes of our action will be? Well, we might know in some sense that sweatshop labor is happening over there, but we don't know what the direct consequence of any of our actions will be, of our purchase will be. So if we buy a t-shirt, the money might actually pay the wages of the person in that retail shop. It could pay for the shop's overheads, its rent, its electricity, etc. So we don't know actually what the direct outcomes of our actions are going to be. So the liability model of responsibility doesn't apply in this case. Now, I agree with Young that ordinary individuals are not morally responsible for structural injustice. And one thing that Young doesn't really bring out enough, I think, and that I try to emphasize, is that structural injustice is not within our control, right? So going all the way back to Aristotle, who argued that there's a control condition on moral responsibility, we can only be held blameworthy for something that was within our control. Structural injustice is way outside of our control. You and I can't control sweatshops or climate change or homelessness or poverty. It's just not within our control. Also, I think that when we think about excusing conditions for moral responsibility, and here I rely on R.J. Wallace, we can also think about how we can be excused from moral responsibility for structural injustice. So the first excusing condition is inadvertence. So in cases of inadvertence, a person does something but doesn't know they're doing that thing, right? So the example that Wallace gives is that, say I'm at a party and I want to walk to the fridge to get a beer. I walk across the room and I accidentally step on someone's hand, right? I didn't set out to step on somebody's hand. I just wanted to cross the room and I accidentally did it. When we think about clothes shopping, we want to go and buy clothes, but we don't necessarily know what harm that might cause down the track. But perhaps you don't think that's very compelling in this case, but there is another excusing condition that I think is relevant, which is coercion, necessity, and duress. So in cases of coercion, we have to do the thing, right? And that might not happen very often when it comes to buying clothes. It can happen in some jobs. You have to wear certain kinds of clothes, so you're coerced into buying those clothes. But for most people, that won't apply. Necessity will apply in some cases, so sometimes you have to buy new clothes. Maybe you have children who are growing and changing constantly. They need new clothes. Maybe you've gained weight or lost weight. Maybe you're pregnant. In all of these cases, you might need to buy new clothes. But I think the most important issue for us and the most relevant for structural injustice theory is duress. So there are all sorts of social norms around clothes, the way that we have to look and present ourselves within our culture in order to participate in our culture. So we're experiencing a certain kind of duress when it comes to clothing norms. Now, these are going to be experienced differently by different social groups. So young women, for example, might feel this pressure a lot more intensely than, say, older men. It's also going to affect people depending on things like other kinds of gender, race, faith, class, occupation, etc. Oh, sorry. Okay. So me and Young both think we're not morally responsible for structural injustice, but does this mean we're not responsible at all? No, it definitely doesn't mean that. And this is one of Young's really big innovations. So she came up with the idea of the social connection model of responsibility. So Young argues that everyone connected to structural injustice shares political responsibility for it. So political responsibility is forward-looking, not backward-looking. So this means instead of looking backwards and saying, hey, you bought that t-shirt from Zara, therefore you're morally responsible for sweatshop labour. No, we don't do that. We look to the future and think, how can we change this together? What can we do going forward to improve this situation? It's shared, not isolating. So again, instead of picking on you or me and saying, hey, you did this, we don't do that. We try and share the responsibility among everyone connected to the injustice. It judges the background conditions. So instead of picking on specific actions, specific purchases of clothes, we look at the overarching structure, right? What is going on here structurally that is creating this situation, this structural injustice? And if we're going to change a structure, it requires collective action. So political responsibility means working together in collective actions in order to try to change the structures. So this is the way in which ordinary people are responsible for structural injustice. We're politically responsible, not morally responsible. Now, Young, I've highlighted here, argues that everyone connected to structural injustice shares political responsibility for it. So she also applies this to, say, corporations, states, all of the agents that are connected to the injustice. And this is where I disagree with Young. As I've already argued, some agents exercise power to maintain unjust structures for their own benefit, what I call deliberate structural injustice, or they fail to alleviate it when it is within their power to do so, what I call avoidable structural injustice. I also think that powerful agents have more elbow room to act within structures than ordinary individuals. So if we look at the Bangladesh Accord example again, you and I, we cannot establish a legally binding agreement in Bangladesh for 8 years to improve fire and building safety conditions. It's not within our power to do that. But powerful garment corporations can take actions like that, right? So they do have elbow room to make changes within these structures. So for these reasons, I argue that powerful agents who could alleviate or who deliberately perpetuate structural injustice bear moral responsibility for it on the liability model, on the traditional account of moral responsibility. And I argue further in chapter 7 of my book that this responsibility persists through time. So I discuss the ongoing responsibility of states and corporations for reparations for slavery. So if a powerful corporation has contributed to injustice in the past and they've never made amends for that, made reparations, that responsibility that they acquired will persist through time as long as that corporate agent persists. I'm not going to go into historical injustice in depth here, but I'm happy to answer questions about that. Okay, so my overarching point here is that an analysis of power provides new insights into responsibility for structural injustice. So we as ordinary individuals are politically responsible for it. We should be sharing the responsibility, engaging in collective action to try and change it, but powerful agents bear moral responsibility for it. Okay, and the final thing I want to look at is structural change. So I would argue that an analysis of power helps explain how change can happen, right? And this is something Young didn't really discuss in much detail, and I think because she lacked this analysis of power. And I use Thomas Fortenberg's situated conception of power in order to explain this, and I'll show you with a diagram. So here we have multinational corporations at the middle, the center, and they exist not on their own, not as actors just in a vacuum. Instead, they exist in a social alignment with lots of other actors, right? So multinational corporations are in alignment with their home state, so they have to follow the laws and procedures of their home state. There's also the receiving state, so the state where they're working and subcontracting, etc. There's also international business lobbies and global finance who will impact on the corporations, international organizations of various kinds like the UN, and also consumers. So it's not that multinationals are acting alone, instead they're in this alignment with all of these other agents that shore up their power. And what this means for subordinate actors in social structures is that they have to find ways of challenging the social alignment. And there's a couple of ways in which Thomas Fortenberg identifies they can do this. So the first is through countering alignments. If subordinate agents can work together, then they can challenge the powerful agents within structures. So the classic way for labour movements to do this is through trade unions. It's a counterbalancing power to the power of corporations. The other way is through alternative alignments. So if garment workers had alternative options, they wouldn't be so dependent on multinational corporations and they wouldn't be as easy to exploit. So if they had social safety nets, proper social safety nets, welfare benefits, etc., or there were other decent jobs that they could take, then they would be able to do those things instead of working in garment corporations. So what does that mean? Well, it means if we want to challenge the power of garment corporations, we build up the capacity of trade unions. We need to campaign for better social safety nets or other jobs that are available for garment workers. But also what we can do, instead of just targeting the multinational corporations, we can look at the other actors in the social alignment and we can get them to try and push the garment corporations for change. So consumers are part of that, but we can also be challenging states for better regulation, international organizations for better agreements. We can put pressure on the financial institutions that are funding these corporations, right? So it's not just about looking at the corporations, but the other ways in which they're embedded in these relationships and tackling those as well. Okay, so what is our political responsibility? Well, political responsibility means developing the capacity to work in solidarity with others to challenge structural injustice, including the victims. So we need to work, if we want to challenge sweatshop labour, for example, we need to work in solidarity with other individuals, organisations, especially the victims of the injustice, and put their needs at the centre. And that means we have to work in solidarity with them. I give the example of boycotts here because this is a really interesting example in the anti-sweatshop movement. The anti-sweatshop movement started with boycotts in the 1990s of companies like Gap, Disney, etc. But what they discovered was that the workers didn't want the boycotts because whenever these corporations were boycotted, they stopped buying clothes from the suppliers and people lost their jobs, right? What the workers wanted was to keep their jobs. They just wanted decent jobs. They wanted better pay, better conditions, fire and building safety, etc. So boycotts didn't work in that movement. And it's when activists in the global north started working with activists in the global south that they realized that and they came up with better tactics. Now, developing the capacity for solidarity is really hard work. So if you look especially in a lot of Black feminist literature, they will talk about the kind of work that you have to do on yourself to unlearn the things that you've learned from your society and being able to learn how to work with other people across differences in a respectful way. It also means being able to adapt to change and maintain commitment to political action over time. So the political landscape is constantly changing, as we know now. It's a very different landscape to when it was when Young was writing her work on structural injustice. So using political responsibility, we have to be able to adapt to those changes, to think, okay, those tactics might have worked 10 years ago, but now we're going to have to try and do something else. And it's also about maintaining political action over time. So if we think about the anti-sweatshop movement, it's been going since the early 1990s. It's now 2025. It's a really long time. You have to sustain activism over time to make change happen. And working in solidarity, we can push the powerful for change, right? So if the powerful are morally responsible for avoidable and deliberate structural injustice, they're probably not going to make the changes on their own. So it's up to us working, using our political responsibility, working in solidarity with each other to push these actors for change. And in the final chapter of my book, I draw on examples from the anti-fossil fuel movement, because I think this is a really interesting movement, because they are fighting on all fronts, right? They haven't just picked one thing. They've thought about all sorts of ways in which we need to challenge the fossil fuel industry. So they've done it through direct action, a kind of classic tactic, but also increasingly litigation. They're also pushing for policy change. They're challenging advertising. So in the Netherlands, campaigners have managed to have fossil fuel advertising banned in Amsterdam. Divestment is a really good tactic. Lots of students are trying to get their universities to divest from fossil fuels. There's challenging the recruitment pipeline. So there are activists trying to encourage young people at university not to go into the oil and gas industry. There's challenging sponsorship of cultural and sporting events, so getting that rescinded. And there's also using the media, of course, so challenging the fossil fuel industry through the media. So there are lots of different tactics that you can use. Okay, so my final point that I want to raise is, how do you decide to act on political responsibility, right? So there are so many structural injustices in the world, it can feel absolutely overwhelming. Like, where do you start? How are you going to get involved in activism? How are you going to take up your political responsibility? And Young helpfully gives us parameters of reasoning, she calls it, for thinking about our political responsibility. And I kind of tweak her parameters of reasoning a little bit. So the first one is benefit. Young describes this as privilege, but I prefer to talk about the structural injustices that we benefit from, right? So say that I am a shopaholic and I can't stop buying clothes, then maybe I should be focusing my attention on the global garment industry. But maybe you benefit from a different kind of structural injustice. Maybe you're a frequent flyer and are really benefiting from the aviation industry. Perhaps you should be focusing your attention there. Whatever it is you're benefiting from, that can be a way to think about, which structural injustice am I going to focus on? What am I going to use my limited time, energy, and resources to do? The second parameter is collective ability. So this means if you're already a member of a collective, you can work within that collective to challenge structural injustice. So an example here is student movements. So students in the anti-sweatshop movement have challenged their universities to buy only fair trade clothing that has the university's logo on it. Or students are using their universities to divest from fossil fuels, right? But it doesn't have to be a university. It could be being a member of a trade union, being a member of a church, just being a member of a local community organization. Whatever kind of collective power you already have by virtue of being a member of a collective, you can use to challenge structural injustice. The third is interest. So when Young talks about interest, she focuses on who has the most interest in changing structural injustice. And for her, that's the victims of the injustice. Now, this is a controversial point. Remember that Young thought that everyone connected to structural injustice shares political responsibility for it. She includes the victims in that, right? And I agree with her on this point, because the point of this is to show that the victims are agents. They can also organize, they can also challenge the injustice that they're experiencing We see that in the anti-sweatshop movement, with garment workers joining trade unions and challenging the injustice. But it is a controversial point. Not everybody agrees with that. But there's a second way I want to think about interest, which is if you're interested in something, that can be a reason to focus your attention on it too. So I got really interested in the anti-sweatshop movement when I was young, and that sustained my interest over time. It's made me go and research it, it's made me go and write about it. So just being interested in a structural injustice, if that can sustain your attention over time and your activism over time, that could be a reason to focus on that. And the final one is proximity. So I've got a picture here of the anti-fracking protests in Balcombe, which is a village in England. So a giant multinational Quadrilla came into Balcombe, was going to start fracking there, and the entire village organised and came out and protested together, engaged in direct action, and they stopped fracking from happening in their village. And interestingly, since then, they've continued to work together. They've created an energy co-op, and now they use solar power to provide the electricity for the schools in the village. So proximity, just being close to a structural injustice flashpoint, could be a reason for focusing your attention there. Okay, so to sum up, I think that structural injustice theory should incorporate an analysis of power. I think that powerful corporate agents with the capacity to change structural injustice, or who deliberately perpetuate it, are morally responsible for it. I think that ordinary individuals are not morally responsible for structural injustice, but they are politically responsible. And political responsibility means working on one's capacity for solidarity and participating in collective action for change. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McKeown. This was wonderful. Very, very rich content, a lot to think about, and a lot that our folks here at the University of Central Florida Center for Ethics are already thinking about. So I'm sure our participants have found this very interesting. So I have already some questions. Feel free to keep sharing questions through the chat with me, and I will add you to the queue. And if you prefer to just voice your own questions, of course, I'll call on you, ask you. If not, I can just read them. So I will start by the questions I already have here. So this one is by Helen Clark, asking if you could say a bit more about how the examples that you mentioned of solving homelessness, particularly you mentioned Finland and the Housing First initiative, or you mentioned Vienna. How have these policies worked to solve the problem? And Helen Clark can, of course, jump in if you have some more specifics about the question you would like to add. Okay, so.
Okay. Yeah, so Finland's Housing First policy. So Finland, of course, I guess it's got a kind of unique problem when it comes to homelessness because it's such a cold country. So people in Finland who are homeless are, at risk of freezing to death, essentially. So it's kind of a more urgent problem for Finland than it is for countries with a temperate climate or a warmer climate. So because of that sense of urgency, Finland decided that they needed to have this policy, this Housing First policy, which is to basically give people housing and get them set up with housing and then go from there. So it doesn't let people be homeless anymore, essentially. The government provides housing to people before everything else. So that's why it's called Housing First. In Vienna, what they did was they have really cheap apartments that are owned by the government, and they're there as social housing. And yeah, that's pretty much eliminated homelessness within that city. So there are policies, options that are available. The problem, of course, is that any kind of policy, any kind of social policy, is going to compete with other kinds of social policy for the government's attention, for funding, right? So the government has to really want to do this. That's why in Finland they really wanted to do this. They had a really good reason for needing to do this, whereas other governments might feel like it's not so important for them to address this, that their funding and resources should go elsewhere. But the point for me is that it's simply that these powerful agents have it within their capacity to alleviate these injustices, right? Now, you might respond that they don't have the capacity if there are so many competing demands on the resources, but I think we would need to look at different countries and look at the situation there to see whether or not that's true. So that's what I try and do in the book, is to use empirical research to investigate these structural injustices from an empirical perspective. I think that's a really important thing to do when we're talking about structural injustice. Like, the theory is essential if we're going to understand these things through a structural injustice lens. But once we actually start applying it, we need to look at the empirical details of what's going on with these different injustices, who could actually do something about it, who has the capacity to change it. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. This was, I think, very, very informative, and it's really nice to get to see how different contexts might treat the same policy problem in different ways. I'll stick with the housing question since we started talking about this example of structural injustice. And Dr. Kubler has a question with regard to homelessness and solutions that may often backfire and lead to different kinds of injustices. So Dr. Kubler, if you're welcome to voice the question.
Yeah, thank you. This question comes on in a timely way, because this morning I was listening to prep for the Super Bowl in New Orleans, which is my birthplace, and is a very poor community. And they're rounding up the homeless and putting them into another location. So they have, I don't know, they said tens of millions of dollars that are being used to create some temporary housing. And I'm not entirely blind. I'm sure they're doing it to make the city look good and, keep the Super Bowl. It brings in tons of money and people benefit from that money, although the homeless and your average person's probably not benefiting the most. My eyes are wide open about the issue. But they interviewed one of these folks living in this homeless camp, and I was struck by the fact that he doesn't want to be relocated. He was very angry. And it strikes me that while there's maybe capacity for top-down solutions like Finland, there's the potential for other injustice insofar as when you forcibly move people, you deprive them of their personal rights and their dignity. And what concerns me further is that very argument could be co-opted by governments to say, well, look, we wouldn't want to move the homeless. We don't want to take their dignity. So I'm just torn with how you balance these values. And, is there a clear prescription for how to go about solving injustice, social injustice, without creating more?
Yeah, great question. I mean, no, there's no prescription. This is the first thing to say, right? It's going to really be on a case by case basis. It's going to be on an evidence-based basis, right? So finding out about the structural injustice and what would actually help in that situation. And at the center of that has got to be the victims, right? So talking to them, what do they want? What do they need? What do they think would address this injustice for them? So you might find that some homeless people don't want to move. But I mean, maybe in this guy's case, I mean, you're talking about forcible removals, right? I don't think when we're talking about alleviating homelessness, it would always be about forcibly removing people. Instead, it would be giving people the option of having state subsidized housing and having decent accommodation to live in. And then maybe they might choose it. And then you might find that some people will still opt out for whatever reasons they might have. But yeah, it's not about forcibly making people go and live in kind of settled accommodation. But I think your question gets at another really important point here, which is that any kind of intervention in social structures might have unintended consequences, right? And that's what's really important about structural injustice theory, I think, is it identified this problem of cumulative unintended outcomes that occur through social structural processes. And we might find that interventions to try to improve structural injustice will actually have some sort of unjust outcome. And I think actually that's going to be inevitable, that sometimes things will not work out, they might backfire, they might have unintended negative consequences. And the point there is to just keep communicating about it, especially with the victims, and trying to fix the problems as they arise, because I don't think we're going to find one size fits all solutions to any of these kinds of problems. Are too complex. We're going to have unintended consequences that aren't very good. And then you just try and work with that and repair it as they come up. This is something that philosophers really hate when I talk about this kind of thing. They're like, no, there must be a solution, and like we all have a duty to do X and then the thing is fixed. And it's like, in the real world, that's not how it works. We try things, it might not work out, we try something else. But as long as we're trying to alleviate structural injustice, I think we're going in the right direction.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the next, well, there's a set of questions that I'll put together, and one of them being mine, I will selfishly just voice them, I guess, to hear your thoughts. So the way you discussed the differences between different kinds of agents included, anyone from people who consume goods are one agent, then you have a multinational corporation who's another agent, and all these are connected, of course. But then we have depending, of course, on the kind of agent, you might have a whole corporation, which is itself a huge social structure, which has its own norms and its own complexity, and people running it. And these people are also differently positioned, such that it's not possible to necessarily make change just because one is part of that multinational corporation. So I guess the question in general might be whether, well, two-pronged question. One is, would it be helpful to distinguish morally blameworthy agents within larger group agents? And this might be kind of, coming also from a critique of theories, against theories of structural injustice, and by theories focusing more on agents. But on the flip side of that also, I'll bring it also back again to structural injustice, because I think it's relevant to people like us who work, for instance, at a university, and we have a lot of our students getting jobs in industry and working for such corporations, and often not having necessarily many options, because at the end of the day, you need a job, you have debt. So what can someone do to, when they are part of such a structure that is also an agent that produces problems, to make changes? So the two sides of the question, if we focus on stakeholders, CEOs, things like that, focus on their moral responsibility, would that be helpful for rethinking how we think about responsibility in general for structural injustice? And on the other side, from the perspective of low power agents within those larger agents, is there something that can be done to alleviate structural injustice kind of from inside that collective agent?
Yeah, this is a super important question. And you'd asked me before the talk, what are you going to research next? And one of the things I'm thinking about is a project on, responsibility within the corporation, right? Because in my book, I oversimplify, right? I say, look, we've got ordinary individuals over here and powerful corporate agents over there, and let's just think about those two different kinds of responsibility. But of course, a powerful corporation is made up of individuals, right? But importantly, as you're highlighting, it's made up of individuals in different hierarchical positions. So I think it's very plausible that we might have, say, the higher ups in the corporation might be morally responsible, whereas people with less power within the corporation might bear political responsibility like other people for these injustices. But I have to think about that further because there is something about opting into the corporation. You know, it's not like citizenship where you don't really have any control over it. With a corporation, you can opt into it or not join it. So that must give you some share of the responsibility that's more than just ordinary political responsibility. But then you're pointing to how lower down people in the corporation are very constrained, right? So if they start speaking out and trying to challenge the injustice from within the corporation, you know, maybe they'll lose their jobs and maybe they need that job, right? So they have kind of conflicting interests. Like, say you work for Shell Corporation, for example, and you work in a Shell garage, you need that job, right? You have this bigger interest, this real interest in combating climate change, but you have this immediate interest in having a job and not challenging the authority of Shell Corporation. So you've got conflicting interests. What do we do with that? At the moment, I don't have a really good answer for you, and that's why I want to think about this war and research it further because I think it's a really crucial question for structural injustice theory, at least the way I think about it. You know, where do you have to be positioned in the corporation to bear moral responsibility for it? Um, what's the responsibility of different agents within the corporation? How can we parse that out essentially? And I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
Thank you. Thank you. That's I think that's just so interesting and complex because at the end of the day, you know, thinking about how uh, a structure essentially involves the way in which all the agents are connected. So kind of resolving this difficulty and choosing what to focus on and highlighting agents or highlighting the structure, each probably sheds different light in different areas and kind of adds complexity to something that is super complex and is just hard to think about and resolve. So I look forward to your upcoming work. I will then. So the next question has to do with pure structural injustice, and I have here Davi, and my apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, and feel free to jump in also if you would like to ask the question, but it pertains to your comment about climate change as being a pure form of structural injustice, yet at the same time seeming, you know, that being controversial, perhaps it's not so pure. We can imagine again, agents who pollute a lot more, who are, you know, run by few people, etc. So can you say a bit more about that and whether there are other cases of pure structural injustice, you know, that you view as perhaps indicative of what such an injustice might look like in the real world?
Thanks. Yeah. So climate change, I struggled with so much because it's so complex. Um, I end up arguing I think it's a pure structural injustice because of the fact that it's so baked into the system. As Nancy Fraser puts it, you know, she says fossil fuel capitalism is just baked in. It's just the way that we live. And because it's so systemic, I think it requires systemic change to change it, to do something really significant about it, which is why I end up saying it's a pure case. But I think it's controversial because at least since 1990, 1990 is usually cited as the date when we all knew, at least the scientific community said, yes, climate change is happening. Yes, it's caused by human behavior, the human activities. Then we knew, and governments had an opportunity to do something about it. And they obviously failed spectacularly in that. And instead, fossil fuel emissions have gone up massively. Partly that was a failure of states. It was also, you know, the fossil fuel industry with their disinformation campaigns and their constant lobbying. And they've acted in all sorts of nefarious ways to make sure that, you know, the fossil fuel industry is perpetuated. Um, but I think I'm with Young on the idea that we can use both the liability model and the social connection model of responsibility at the same time, right? So we can say we've got this structural injustice that we're all politically responsible for, but there are also bad actors within the structures who are doing bad things and ought to be held morally responsible. And that's what I would say we should do to the fossil fuel corporations, the states that have failed to act. rather than saying they're responsible for the structural injustice itself, because that's the thing that we all need to change together. So that's my take on climate change. But yes, you're right. It's so hard to find a pure case, but I've been thinking a lot about this, and actually, I think we can find way more pure cases of structural injustice if we look at a smaller scale. So one thing I've been thinking about is disability inclusion in universities, right? So a much smaller thing than climate change, the global poverty, right? This is because I myself have a hidden disability and I faced a lot of institutional barriers because of that. And I've talked to many other academics with disabilities who face similar kinds of structural barriers and students as well. Now, I think in this case, nobody's deliberately trying to exclude disabled academics, right? I mean, maybe some random bad actors, right? But the system, I don't think, is trying to exclude us. Um, Instead, it's really an unintended consequence of accumulation of all sorts of policies, history, the creation of buildings that aren't accessible, the creation of structures of prestige and networks that don't really accommodate disability, that kind of thing. It's really a cumulative process. And to try and change it, we can't point to one actor. Like, sure, we can say my university should do X, Y, Z, but that's not going to change the system of academia that makes it very hard for disabled scholars to participate in the kind of competitive, productive research culture and that kind of thing. So I think that that's a pure case of structural injustice. And I suspect that when we look at these smaller scale examples, we're going to find way more pure cases than we can at the global level. That's my intuition on this problem.
Thank you very much. We have a question about epistemological presuppositions and framings that might change the way we think about action against structural injustice. And Josh, would you like to?
Yeah, I can go ahead and ask it. So mostly the question is just about how we're assessing, even if we're trying to distribute personal or moral responsibility, but I'm thinking like this sort of epistemological assumptions we're making about what we're capable of or what effects are likely to happen is going to change pretty drastically what seems like the things we might end up being responsible for, right? And the deeper worry then is that like, do you have, oh, sorry, my phone's picking me up. Do you have some answer for how we should think about, I don't know, what way we assess what we're possible of or what sort of control we have? Because I'm worried that like a lot of the work of determining responsibility is just going to fall on this epistemological question of how likely is it that this particular action I have is going to make a difference? And I mean, just as base sort of examples, like there was a lot of talk during, well, the ongoing genocide that the US just stopped arming Israel, it stops. Or we can say more, I think, with clear epistemological evidence, if we give X amount of money to school lunch programs, there'll be this many school lunches. And, sometimes people say, oh, if we end capitalism, then blah, blah, blah happens. And those seem to have very different epistemological problems that would change our control or responsibility. So yeah, that's the sort of question, just your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think that's why empirical evidence is so important, right? So as I was saying earlier, like I don't think as individuals we can just say, okay, I'm going to do this, and that's my contribution to alleviating structural injustice. It's about being in a dialogue with other people who are acting collectively to try and do something about it. We're going to get a lot more information by working in groups, by working especially with groups of the victims who have more epistemological insight into what the injustice is that they're suffering from and how it might actually be alleviated. So that's, the sweatshop example. We don't want boycotts, we want better jobs, right? So always kind of centering the victim perspective instead of just taking a top-down approach. But doing that requires working with other people, right? So instead of just sitting at home and thinking, okay, I'm going to do X or Y, you've got to go out there and engage with the activist community around that issue and try and find out what the best practices are and what actually works, what doesn't work, and doing it that way. So yeah, it's a bit like not just being an armchair philosopher and trying to engage with the empirical situation, especially the victims' perspectives. Yeah, getting the evidence, essentially.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. The next question, I think, tries to, well, we have a couple of questions pertaining to the issue of responsibility. So one by Bill Fernandez. Bill, do you want to say your question? Oh, we can't hear you. Oh,
Yeah, we can't hear you.
no worries, no worries. I'll say it for you. So it seems that thinking about responsibility in, for instance, corporate actors kind of points us toward one way of thinking about responsibility for structural injustice that is kind of broad and thinking about interrelatedness, things of that nature. Can we apply that to other spheres? For instance, when thinking about political power and politicians, and whether they, as individual agents, perhaps could assume responsibility by way, not simply just giving them a code of ethics, hoping that they'll follow it, but in ways that might make meaningful change in such broad scale injustices. And Bill, I hope I've made the justice to your question.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think actually this ties in with your question, Alex, right? Because it's about individuals in powerful positions within structures. And this is a topic, again, that I haven't really thought about enough and I haven't researched enough. Because what do we do when an individual is actually powerful within a structure and not just a corporate agent, right? And we can say that some individuals, like politicians, who are in the cabinet in the UK, for example, are pretty powerful, right? They have a position where they can actually make some significant changes. They could influence structures. Or we might have powerful agents like, or powerful individuals like tech bros and billionaires and trillionaires, like Elon Musk type people, right? These people as individuals have a lot of power and might even have the power to change some structures, right? So what do we do about those people? I would say those people are morally responsible for their contributions to structural injustice or their failures to change it whenever it's within their power, because it comes down ultimately to capacity and the power to be able to make change. Yeah, but again, I actually started an epilogue to my book where I discussed the moral responsibility of powerful individuals, but I didn't have time to finish it before the deadline, which was really frustrating. I didn't get to research it thoroughly enough, so I took it out. But yeah, I think that those kinds of powerful individuals are probably morally responsible.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really interesting indeed. I have a question by Michael Buchanan, and Dr. Kubler, feel free to jump in if we have a limit. I know with time you're on top of, but it's a question about the connection between moral responsibility and political responsibility, and whether kind of one implies the other. Michael, you're welcome to jump in if you would like to explain your question.
Okay, great. My video's off because of Wi-Fi, but a lot of this has been covered in one way or another. But so my question is about just the term political responsibility, and it may just be sort of a definitional issue, as a way of categorizing. But one way to view political responsibility is just a subset of a more sweeping moral responsibility. But this question, I think, could be tied to the last set of comments. So if each individual's, if each agent's actions are not sufficient to bring about justice, but still might be necessary to avoid a collective action problem that leads to structural injustice, can we still say, well, this individual, though they're not one of the powerful individuals that we just were talking about, so they're, let's call them weaker, but because of the nature of group responsibility, there's still like a moral duty for each individual to act politically responsible, even though it seems like That's not sufficient. And it's obviously not, it's a problem with collective action. It's actually not even necessary that any one individual acts, but there's still a duty, maybe an imperative. It's a bit of a Kantian issue. Still, everybody still has to do the right thing. To really, and the consequences will fall out. So that's basically my question. Thanks for the great talk.
Thank you. Yeah, so I have a whole chapter of my book on this because it's such a complicated question. I mean, it gets into real nitty-gritty philosophy and like points of difference between philosophers being really finicky about this. So some people do argue that political responsibility is a type of moral responsibility. So someone who takes that position is Andrea Sangiovanni, precisely for the point that you make, right? That we all are contributing, even if it's only a tiny amount, right, to structural injustice. And that's enough to ground our moral responsibility. There are also, people who want to say our political responsibility is a moral responsibility to push the boundaries of our social roles. That's Robin Shang's position. She argues that political responsibility means, whatever social role you have as an educator, as a parent, whatever it might be, you should push the boundaries of your social role as much as possible in the direction of alleviating structural injustice. And it's a moral kind of responsibility to do that. And Young even is totally ambiguous about this because sometimes she sort of drops in the word moral when she's talking about political responsibility. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, I thought it was a different kind of responsibility. That's what you started out with. And then you end up conflating moral and political, and I don't really know what's happening here. I argue that the best way of thinking about political responsibility in terms of moral responsibility is as a virtue, right? And this is because political responsibility cannot specify a certain action that you're supposed to do, right? So there isn't one action that you can do to change sweatshop labor, for example. Instead, it involves being politically responsive and engaging in different kinds of action over time. And that's more like a moral virtue, right? It's been about being responsive to others. It can change, the content of it will change. And also Young talks about this in terms of the language of responsibility and duty. She thinks that a duty is doing a specific act on a specific occasion, whereas a responsibility is this more general sphere of responsibility where you have some discretion to decide what it is you're going to do with it. So I think we can think of it in terms of moral virtue, but I want to take a step back from that. And I go with Arendt on this, who has this pretty interesting idea of political virtue, right? So instead of a moral virtue, it's a political virtue. And Arendt's examples of political virtue are promising and forgiving. And that's because you can only promise and forgive in relation to others, right? So it has to be a relational political act. We need it in politics because you have to be able to make promises to work with other people in politics, and you have to be able to forgive people for whenever they do stuff wrong so that you continue working together through politics. And I would add to that solidarity, and that's where I think political responsibility comes in. You can only act in solidarity with other people, right? And you have to develop that capacity for solidarity through work on yourself and with others. And that's why it's kind of like a virtue. So I settle on this idea of political virtue, but really it's quite a convoluted conversation and I try to get at it in a very long chapter of the book. But yeah, disentangling the moral and political in this topic is really quite challenging, but that's my take on it.
Oh, thanks. That's very helpful.
Well, thank you, Dr. McKeown. And I think we're out of time, so I'll turn it to Dr. Kubler to close us out.
Well, thank you, Dr. McKeown, for helping us understand more about structural injustice and what we can do about it. And I'd like to thank Dr. Nicolaitis for moderating our discussion, and I thank our participants for great questions and engagement. Ethically Speaking is made possible with support from the National Science Foundation and many UCF partners you see listed here. So I'd like to thank them all for helping bring this series to you. And lastly, once again, thank you for your participation, and I hope you'll join us for future presentations in Ethically Speaking.